Hey reader, welcome back here to the channel. This is Centaur here, and today we are continuing with part 3 of our transport series. Today looking at the tactical transport. Now it's worth noting this is one of the most common ways that you'll see transports used. And to some extent, it might even be, while the drop ship, which we talked about last time, is kind of the way most people tend to think about transports. I take a big squad, I put them in a big transport, and I get them somewhere. The tactical transport is the other common way that you'll tend to think about it. And that is a small transport that takes typically one unit, possibly also including an officer, to a specific place to do a specific role for the unit. It is not typically assigned to controlling objectives or anything like that. It is typically tied to the unit inside getting to do whatever it is that you purchased the unit to do. And they typically have a shorter range or limited number of bodies. And so because of that, their likelihood of getting removed if they try to foot slog it somewhere is quite high. This one I think is a good point to mention as number 3 because after this you start getting really weird uses for transports. But when it comes to putting guys in transports and moving them up in a very quick and expedient way, this is kind of the end of the traditional way of doing transports. And so today these first 3 kind of create a trio, and we're going to finish those up today. So what do we mean by a tactical theory regarding transports? Okay, this is typically a tiny transport that is transporting a tiny unit that is going to fulfill a specific role. So for example, over here we have the humble Jeep, right? Jeeps, civilian cars, are by far the most commonly used units in this role, although there are others that are also used. And you'll typically see something with that transport 3 capacity of a bazooka team or other anti-tank team. A flamethrower team is also very common. And sometimes that third slot will be filled with an officer. This was used primarily in second edition to make sure that the Jeep would have that morale bonus, both so that it could reliably get where it needed to go, but also if you were planning to outflank the Jeep or whatever tiny vehicle this was, they had a higher chance of being able to come in, especially since transports don't generally have rules like behind enemy lines, where they would remove that -1 penalty to arrive from outflank. We do tend to see vehicles able to do that more often now in third edition because national special rules tend to include, like, your units ignore the -1 from outflank. But especially in second edition, we didn't see that. In third edition, I think we're going to see this quite a bit more, both because you have more officers to go around as a general rule. But in addition, because they have a higher morale bonus, and you're potentially also ignoring that penalty to come in from outflank, I think we're just in general going to see more officers in more of these. So that way you're looking at closer to a morale 10, morale 11 trying to come in, which is a very reasonable chance that you're going to arrive. Most commonly, these are going to be a 3-man transport with a 2-man team as the primary target that they're throwing out there. But you might also see 5-man transports with maybe 2 such teams. So, for example, if you're playing the Great Britain, you might see a Bren carrier carrying 2 Piat teams as one example, right? Or 2 flamethrower teams, right? And then that still leaves a 5th spot for maybe an officer, right, to be able to do their job. So what are the advantages of tactical theory? So whereas the Russian doll clown car style of approach and the dropship theory place a lot of eggs or one big egg in only one basket, tactical theory places the tiniest egg possible in the tiniest basket possible, with the thinking being that it will be smaller. It is not worth as much. If something happens to it, we are not out a dramatic number of points. Okay. It can also be to clear a specific type of unit out from the enemy side of the board with a deep strike capability. So, in other games, deep strike typically means like you're coming in from orbit and you're dropping down, you're hitting the ground or something like that. In some games, like say the Middle Earth strategy battle game, there are sometimes units that can like pop up suddenly in forests or rocks or caves or something like that, kind of representing people that had, kind of lived underground in the case of the hobbits, or goblins, or lived in that kind of environment like trolls, and they can suddenly come out at you because they were happenstantially living in that forest or in that cave. The closest we get in bolt action is a unit coming in from outflank, right? And we want them to be able to reach well beyond 6 inches of the edge of the board, right? Because in order to advance and then fire, you would only be able to move 6 inches, maybe 9 inches if you are a cavalry unit, 12 inches if you're like a wheeled vehicle. But in general, you'd be pretty close to the edge of the board, and then there'd be the reach of your weapon. And if you're talking like a flamethrower with only 6 inches for infantry, 12 inches for vehicles, all an opponent needs to do is move everything near the center, and you're not actually going to be able to do very much to them, right? Especially if you're suffering that move and shoot penalty on the turn and you're not within point blank range. So what the transport does is it allows you to get potentially a 12 to 24-inch move if it's wheeled, 9 to 18-inch move if it's a half track. Admittedly, only 9 if it's a tracked vehicle, but it allows you to get a good bit of extra movement before you even have to drop the unit, and then you get the additional range off of that. So if you can imagine a wheeled vehicle moving 24 inches up on an advance, and then the maybe an officer inside also snaps to the flamethrower team, like that assault engineer squad that you see over there for the Germans, Pioneer section over there. Here you've got a group with submachine guns and also a flamethrower. If they can get snapped and they can get commanded to jump out from the car as well, now you've got effectively 30 inches worth of move or 18 inches worth of move before you have to trigger the range on your submachine guns or your flamethrower. You can get to a lot more units that way. It does mean that you are susceptible to ambush, just like the others, fair enough. However, your investment here is generally dramatically smaller, right? If you've taken an inexperienced officer for 20 to 21 points, in an inexperienced Jeep at like 14 points, and a regular Pt3 team for the British for only like 40 points, I mean, you spend what, like 75 points on a unit that could remove a 100 plus armored vehicle easily, and a 150 to 200 point armored vehicle pretty reasonably. Uh, that's that's a good investment, right? So the benefit of the tactical theory is, yeah, it's everything's smaller. After they're done doing their shooting, they're probably going to get removed, just being honest, right? It's not like dropship where the thing that you're dropping out is likely to stick around. But at the same time, the over under on your return on investment is generally quite high with this theory. It also means that in general, this is an easier unit to place. Both the size of the transport is typically physically smaller, so you can actually fit it in spots that you wouldn't otherwise be able to fit things. You might even be able to put it like in an alleyway between two buildings that a wider vehicle just wouldn't be able to go through. It also means that because you haven't spent as many points on it, you could potentially have multiples of these, right, running across the battlefield because you only spent half as many points on it as you might have spent on something else, which means you can get better placement because you can hedge, right? You could be like, okay, I'm going to place all these guys here. I'm going to place these guys here and these guys here and so on and so forth. And that works out really well. The disadvantages, of course, of tactical theory is, first of all, they aren't very survivable, right? So here we have a Polish Fiat, a small civilian car, and jumping out of it, we have an AT rifle team. This AT rifle team has done a lot of work for me over the years. It has gone with me to 3 tournaments and has won 2 of them. And I'll tell you, AT rifle teams, they may not be the strongest option for this, but they get some very interesting shots, and they're much more likely to get side or rear shots if you outflank them in a civilian car using tactical transport theory. But we're also honest. They're going to get removed, right? You're talking 2 guys at regular, probably, possibly even inexperienced. It doesn't take much shooting in order to remove these guys. If they get assaulted, they're probably gone. The car itself is likely to be removed, right? Like the stuff that you're dropping here is not likely to actually survive. And the most vulnerable time is right after you do the whole advance thing and they come in on the board or they move up from where your lines are, they drop out, they take their shot. The rest of that turn and the beginning of the turn after is the most vulnerable time because they've already gone if it's the same turn, and so they can't go down. They have to be in cover. If they aren't in cover, then they're really vulnerable. And at the beginning of the next turn, sure, they could go down potentially as a reaction to being attacked. But one, that is not a reasonable chance that you're going to actually keep the team because, again, one guy missing and suddenly you're rolling morale, right? But second, and more than that, your opponent then has quite a few ways they can react to that because the unit isn't doing anything for the rest of the turn, right? They could maneuver people right up to you and hit you at point blank range. They could assault you. They could just move the target away if you didn't remove it. And in the case of something like an AT rifle team, pretty reasonable chance that they're going to be able to move it, right? You don't have a really high chance of destroying anything unless it's a soft skin vehicle. So toward that end, this is really one shot wonder theory is really the thinking behind it. You really have one shot. After that, it really all depends. If the rest of the army can pin down and suppress whatever might be able to remove the team, they might get a second or a third. But from a mental framework, I would plan on you get one good round. After that, everything's going to be a little bit harried until the rest of your guys can provide the cover that they need. In addition, and this should be obvious, not all nations are created equal, right? So when it comes to tactical theory, unlike Russian Doll and Dropship, not everybody gets a really good anti-tank option. Not everybody gets a flamethrower team, period. In the case of Norway, not everybody even gets an anti-tank team, period, right? It can be really hard to get something effective with tactical theory. Whereas, for example, with dropship theory, everybody has a veteran squad that can take at least 5 dudes, right? If you're not counting Norway, which currently, as of the Get You By PDF and was not fixed in the recent errata that came out as of this publishing just like a week or two ago, they can't even take extra guys on their 5-man veteran squad. They can take extra guys on the inexperienced and regular squad, but they can't take it on the veterans. So the veterans are still locked at 5. But if you discount Norway and you're looking at every other nation, most nations can take 8 to 11 to 20 veterans. So when it comes to dropship theory, for example, everybody can do that relatively reasonably. Tactical theory, it really depends on the nation that you have. Some nations get really good options for it. Some nations do not. Your mileage is going to vary. So what transport should you choose if you're going with more of a tactical perspective? First of all, definitely consider the transport capacity. I would not go above a transport capacity of 6, which would be an officer in a 5-man team, maybe a group of engineers with a flamethrower, maybe some extra submachine guns thrown in there. But in general, 3 to 5 is probably where you're going to live. Again, 2-man team, possibly plus an officer, maybe 2-man teams plus an officer, or just a 5-man team on its own, right? And that'll be the job for you. Are armored vehicles worth it? I think this is a serious question because, again, the whole point of tactical theory is that we're not spending a lot of points on something. So if you can get a really cheap damage value 7 plus armored vehicle, okay, the Poles, for example, get one that only has a transport capacity of 5. It's relatively cheap. It's half track, so it can move through rough terrain. Whether it should or shouldn't be open topped is a question for what the current rules are saying. And historically, there was only one option for that. So I guess we'll see what happens. But hey, rules, right? But the point being is, do you actually need an armored vehicle? A Bren carrier is actually a good delivery device, especially if you know that you're going to be going up against a lot of guys who run like, tons of machine guns, right? Or something like that. And so you want to make sure that you at least don't get removed outright. They just got to shoot at you a lot of times to stack pins. But therein lies the real question, right? Like if the goal of this thing is to do a quick drop and everybody's getting dropped very, very swiftly out of this thing, do you actually need an armored vehicle? Or are you spending double the points to get a little more survivability, often open-topped, right? There are some nations that can do armored vehicles quite nicely. So, for example, France and Belgium both get the VUDB Berlier. Relatively cheap at under 60 points. They can carry 7 men, which means you could do like a 5-man engineering section for France, along with maybe a 2-man officer section. And you can still snap everybody out of there in a single turn. You're getting suppressive fire from the light machine gun, and you're fully buttoned up. So small arms aren't going to do anything to you. You might consider that, though at the same time, is that better than 2 civilian cars carrying a flamethrower team each with an officer in each for the same cost? I don't know. I feel like maybe there's a little more variance one way or another. It's tricky, okay, as to how you make that work. Tactical theory would probably say don't do the big squad. That's probably more of a dropship style build. Instead, do the smaller transports and just make sure that they deliver the goods before the vehicle gets destroyed. Do you need to be able to move through rough terrain? Do you need to be amphibious so you can cross water obstacles? The good news is, on the whole, I don't think you really need amphibious for transport on a tactical choice, although a Schwimmwagen is a perfectly viable option if you're playing Germany. However, the ability to move through rough terrain could be highly useful, especially if you're playing on one of those boards where the rough terrain tends to be closer to the edges. Maybe because they're doing like a village, and so they wanted the village to be roughly centralized, and so they've got woods on either side, right? If that's your situation, it could be highly useful to instead put some half tracks on that tactical vehicle. Not all of them will get the option to. It's actually relatively rare. Kettenkrad being a good example of this, again, from Germany. They've got all different kinds of options for tactical transports, and they're one of the best armies in general for tactical transports. But is that necessary? Okay, mileage is going to vary. It's going to be based on the boards that you're going to be seeing. It really is the question of, do you want more options for how you deploy the unit, deploying them normally and taking advantage of cover, or bringing them in from outflank, and just consider what it is that you might need in order to get the unit delivered as quickly as possible. Asking the question, do you need double movement on roads? For tactical transports, I'm just going to be honest, I think the answer is yes. I think a fully tracked tactical transport is probably a bad idea. Maybe the Bren carrier accepted, only because for the armies that can take a Bren, they don't get a lot of 5-man transport options. Okay. So in general, I think double movement is better. A Bren carrier will help to keep your men alive a little bit longer, though probably heavily pinned. But a 6-man capacity heavy field car might be just as good. And for example, I mean, while you could technically fit 5 dudes, maybe 2 flamethrower teams, and an officer in a Bren carrier, there isn't an army with a Bren carrier that can snap both of those 2 flamethrower teams and the Bren carrier on the same turn, unless they're using a company commander, which admittedly, hey, fair enough. If that's what you want to use a company commander for, be my guest. But there are a good number of armies that have, say, a heavy field car who could snap the heavy field car, the guys inside the heavy field car, all in the same turn, right? A lot of armies that can do that. And the final question is veterancy. I think in general for tactical, you could get away with inexperience, especially if you have an officer in there. You can probably get away with regular, and if you're one of those nations that gets the to ignore the -1 when coming in from outflank, I think you can definitely do that. But in general, I think inexperienced for regular is kind of where you want to live. Again, the veterancy of veteran, while useful because it does mean you are probably going to pass your orders even if you start taking a lot of pins, the point of the tactical transport is to quickly deliver the unit and get them out. That is the whole point. So in an ideal world, you only really have to activate reliably once, and that's ideally the first turn that you can. So when it comes to deploying the transport, what do you want to think about? Well, similar to the others, because this is just generally true of transports, you want to make sure that you're deploying with cover, which will give you the ability to mitigate pins that are coming your way, remove potential damage that could be dealt to you. You also want to still make sure that they have a path, okay? We want to be able to swiftly move into position, be able to get up to stuff. And if you have taken recce on these vehicles, because you might take a recce platoon and add recce onto, say, a bunch of Jeeps for carrying bazookas or Piats or civilian cars or Kettenkrads or something like that for carrying Panzer Shreks or AT rifles or whatever, you want to make sure that you have an option for a recce move. And in this case, over there at the bottom right, we have our Jeep. It has the officer in the flamethrower team that we showed on the previous slide. Its recce move is just going to be moving a little further back, away from whatever enemy there is, so they can hide behind that ruin that's directly to its left. Okay? And this is going to give you an opportunity, if you need to be able to save the vehicle, just in case you want to maybe just wait until the next turn, right? You want to make sure that you have that if you've taken recce. Okay? So you want to plan your location for wherever you're going to drop these tactical transports before you end up thinking through anything else in your army. You want to make sure that you've got these spots because they are going to take up priority. You also want to make sure that you deploy it late. You don't necessarily want to deploy it last. And there's a reason for that. First of all, you could have multiples of these tactical transports. And so I can't tell you last if you're going to have more than one. But second, and more than that, you don't actually need to deploy it after the opponent has pretty much deployed all their forces. You just need to drop it once they deploy something that you can actually take on with this. And that gives you the option for holding back other things, like, for example, your armored units in case they have a tactical transport, or maybe you're having tactical transport supporting a dropship or supporting a, clown car Russian doll sort of transport, right? If that's the case, it's probably better to deploy those units after the tactical transport. and just put down the tactical transports because you know where the threat already is in the enemy line. And then you can present something that's that's advantageous to your transport without necessarily holding it off to the very last, because you already know where this thing can go and still be effective and reliable. Okay. Also, remember to give down orders to your passenger units first. This just always goes, right? Maybe you put down 1 or 2 units just so the opponent has something to plan around, right? Fair play, that sort of thing. But in general, don't be placing the transport before you place the dudes, okay? Just put the units down because they're going inside. They can't do anything else. Just put them down and then place the stuff. If you're going to hold them in reserve, I would definitely include an officer, just because, again, we want to make sure these guys come on when we want them to. There's no point of having a tactical transport if the window of opportunity for their tactical usage disappears. So got to make sure that it comes up. Consider regular for the transport if you're going to put it in reserve, just to make sure that it comes on a little more reliably. This does give you some level of better counter deployment. However, if you're trying to counter deploy your enemy, you might consider just putting this in outflank. I suspect this is actually the most effective transport for outflanking, especially if you have an officer. One, because it means that starting as early as the first drop on turn 3, you could bring it in from off the board. It hasn't taken any pins yet. Immediately drop, into a useful space, and then start jumping out the guys, right? After they've already been working. And some people, because of how the game is going, they may be thinking about what's currently on the board, and they might plumb forget what you have in outflank, okay? I was able to successfully stop people from crossing over to my deployment zone edge in a tournament game because they completely forgot that I had an AT rifle team in reserve, okay? If that AT rifle team had a transport, we could have done even more with it than we did. So you might consider leaving people in outflank because holding them off the table does make them more effective, right? You can quickly get to where you need to go. The opponent may not even remember that you're there. They may not be planning on a line of attack in order to keep you out of there. And if you can get the first drop on that turn, they may not have the opportunity to put a unit in ambush, right, before you end up going. So toward that end, I think that's at least worth considering. Then comes the rush, right? So first of all, run or advance, most of the time you should be doing an advance order because you want to be getting as much of that movement while still being able to drop the unit. Okay. However, there might be situations where you might need to perform a run. Okay. Maybe there aren't a lot of roads. Maybe your target unit is still pretty far back and you need to be able to get to it. If so, just again, remember what we talked about earlier. You should be ending your move in cover. Okay. Next question is distance. Will the passengers actually be able to do their job when they exit the vehicle? Okay. In this case, I'm not going to lie, looking over at the example over there on the right, I didn't actually know whether the Jeep was going to have the distance in order to drop a flamethrower team. A bazooka team, definitely. But a flamethrower team, I'm not sure. Can it actually reach that Haunamag transport, which is what we wanted to do? The thinking being, if we can burninate the transport with guys still in it, well, now that's fantastic, right? Like that's the dream job right there. And so we're going to give it a try and see what happens. In this case, we went ahead, we moved up on an advance. We did the first pivot at the first crossroads, second pivot at the second crossroads, basically got as far up as we could on that 24-inch move, dropped the unit out 6 inches ahead, and it turns out we clipped the vehicle by like less than half an inch. Okay, it's very, very tight, but they would be able to do it. If you can do that first draw of first turn against an enemy with no ambushes in the way, that could be a really big start to the game. And if you lose the flamethrower team, if you lose the Jeep afterwards, that's about the same cost as the Haunamag, let alone any engineers that we clear out or the officer that we clear out that are inside of it, right? So toward that end, it works out pretty okay. All right, we want to make sure that we're using the officer snap too, right? We're going to snap the transported unit as our 2 guys that we're putting in here. So in general, you don't need a company commander in here, though obviously mileage will vary depending on how many units you have in your tactical transport. And then looking at it from a cover perspective, you're really not asking as much the question of, does the transport have cover? If it does, great. If not, no worries. It already did its job. The real question is going to be, does the unit have cover? This is the one disadvantage of how this Jeep had to deploy its payload. And that is the Jeep itself has a little bit of cover from the sides, but not really much elsewhere. The officer that it dropped the officer over there into that redoubtment, which I'm probably going to be removing. I was thinking about modeling it up, but it looks a little too big, so I might end up removing it. We'll see with what the final board looks like. He drops out first, shoots his submachine gun at the Hanomag, the thinking being, hey, if we can add pins, that's always a good thing right before a flamethrower goes, right? And then the flamethrower team jumps out after that to attack. The officer is fine. The flamethrower team, on the other hand, and this is the sad part, is not safe at all. If they miss with the flamethrower, which admittedly it's on like threes, so it's not like a really high chance of missing, but if they do miss, or if they hit, they don't do any wounds, units inside all, the Hanomag passes, it's not actually going to run off the table or anything like that. That flamethrower team is in a lot of trouble. They have no cover. They were only purchased at regular because I was trying to keep it a little bit tighter in terms of points. That is not an easy place to be. So I present this as a case of not necessarily what to do. This is an example of a Hail Mary pass, as we say here in the United States, which is an American football term. That basically means that your guys are just going to go running as far as they can, sprinting down the field, and you're going to lob the ball really, really far down the field, and you hope they catch it. Okay. That's what this is. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So be prepared. When it comes to dropping off the passengers, there are a couple things we still want to think about, right? So first of all, if you have a pivot left at the end of your movement, is it worthwhile for you to adjust your pivot so that way your vehicle is lined up to provide better cover for the people that you were transporting, right? If this was not a flamethrower team and it was a bazooka team, it might have actually been a better idea to kind of leave it a little more cockeyed, the transport a little more cockeyed, so that way you can put your bazooka team, at least one guy from your bazooka team, behind it to give yourself a bit of soft cover, right? That way you wouldn't be fully exposed like this flamethrower team is right here. There's also a question, of course, of footprint, right? So units have to be at least an inch apart, so make sure that you're leaving space. Of course, with a tactical transport, how big is a unit actually going to be? 2 models, maybe 3 models? It's really not going to be that much, right? Again, asking the question, are your units actually ending in cover or are they not? Does the transport have to fulfill that role? And then the question of objectives, right? With a tactical transport, if you know that there's an objective nearby, do you have to get up in a single turn and maybe leave yourself exposed? That way you're removed and then causing a roadblock to everybody else? Or would it be better to go a slightly shorter distance, keep a little bit further back, but with plenty of movement to be able to get to the objective on the following turn, drop the guys off, clear the objective of all of the threats, right? If this was an objective-based game, and let's say that there was an objective located in the ruin over there to the right of the Hanomag, you can move up like this and attack, but there's a very decent chance that every unit that you threw up there is going to get removed. Maybe it would be better for the Jeep to have moved up a little shorter and instead dropped off all of the units in that embankment. And maybe the flamethrower team does a run action to run a little further into that defensive position, and you still fire down rain with the SMGs, but now you're a little more resilient. So that way next turn you could then move up with the flamethrower and attack. And the Jeep is still safe. It can run back and grab a second set of units if needed, things like that. There's a lot of options that you have that you really should be thinking about from an objective standpoint, right? Because the problem with an objective-based game is once you clear the units out, you have to actually hold the spot, right? You can't just walk away and leave. So things to consider. And then finally, when it comes to retreating the transport, I'm just going to be honest. The overwhelming majority of tactical transports, you are not going to stand and fight with. You purchase this thing cheap. A lot of them, if they take machine guns, they lose their transport capacity. So at that point, they aren't even tactical transports at all. These are very, very rare that you would stand and fight. Again, it's going to be situations like the Bren carrier, maybe a very, very, very short Hanomag. There are some small German transports that can take a machine gun and don't lose their transport capacity. But again, these are extremely rare cases, right? So in general, don't plan on this being a stand and fight vehicle. Its job is to drop off the guys and then on the next turn, get out of there, conserve the order dice. That's your job. You also want to make sure when you end your move that you set up for a recce move, right? So again, if you purchase recce on a Jeep, you don't need to activate it in order to get it out of there. If you purchase recce, you can just recce away as a reaction to an attack, or it could be your very, very last order dice where you then choose to retreat it on a given turn, right? You don't have to activate them early if you make that 10-point purchase. Maybe that makes it worth it, maybe it doesn't. Be watching for lateral retreats and lateral support. It doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. So for example, if you knew that you had a threat that could be taken care of with a bazooka, let's say somebody has a truck full of guys, and you advance up a bazooka team, you might actually keep the officer inside of the Jeep and not actually move him out of the Jeep. The thinking being, well, I'm going to drop the bazooka. The bazooka is going to hit, assuming we can get it to, say, like point blank range, it's going to hit on 3s. It's going to wound on 2s. The thing is gone. The guys are going to come piling out of it, taking wounds and stuff like that. So I can keep my tactical units pretty close by, knock out the vehicle very reliably. And then on the following turn, just mount everybody back up into the Jeep, and the Jeep goes whooshing off, right? So in this case, since the Jeep wouldn't have moved yet for the turn, start of the new turn, bazooka team jumps inside. I would probably just activate the officer and have him do his snap 2 order, and then just jump the bazooka guys right back into the Jeep, and then issue the order to the Jeep to advance or run, and just have it move back to a place that's safe, either laterally across the line, to support it another place, or a little bit further back behind the line, so that way it's a little bit safer depending on what your cover situation looks like. But that allows them to then redeploy to another part of the battlefield where they may be more useful. Sometimes your opponent doesn't have multiple vehicles or multiple big infantry threats in the same spot. They put just one there on its own because maybe that's all they thought they needed for a given section of the battlefield. And so because of that, you might be able to remove the threat that you are particularly well tied to deal with, and then get out of there before your opponent has a chance to counter you with something like, say, a machine gun laden tank, right? It is possible to do a second load where you drop off guys, you come back, you then drop off another set of guys, right? So like in the example that we had above, if this flamethrower team has been dropped off, it's flamed the guys, and now maybe we're getting into a flamethrower battle with the engineers in the following turn. We could pull the Jeep back, and then on turn 3, we could load it up and move it up, and then on turn 4, drop it out. But you can already see here what the problem is with the tactical side of things. It's a lot of turns to do this and actually make it work. And by that point, it's very possible that the tactical threat that you were trying to deal with is either not in position where you want it to be, or it's already gone, depending on what it is that you have supporting the rest of your troops, right? Sometimes those long-range tank duels actually do work. Sometimes long-range artillery does actually range in, or it does actually hit directly, and you do end up removing enemy targets instead of just putting pins on them. So you can second load. My general thinking is, with a tactical transport, if you want a unit deployed tactically and moved up tactically, buy a transport for it, because they're not that expensive. And so between these three, these are the three primary means of looking at transports, right? We're primarily purchasing these as a carrier, either for a lot of units in a single activation, or one really big unit with one really big transport to get it up there where it needs to be. Or it's a tiny transport moving up tiny unit just to get them into the one specific niche spot where they're supposed to be. The next 4 that we're going to talk about in this series involve transports or the ability to move infantry quickly, but they do not employ them necessarily in this role, okay? And so just know that we're starting a pivot point here within our series where we're going to talk about the other uses of transports and how you can effectively transport men up, because there are these things, while they are useful, if you limit yourself to thinking about speed and mobility in these ways, or that transports are only useful for moving people up so they can get to locations, you're going to miss out on some of the utility of transport vehicles, and you're going to miss out on some of the other interesting ways and quite useful ways to be able to get added mobility on your men. But if you've been enjoying this series, please let us know. If you have thoughts on the tactical transport, if there's anything that I left out, please do feel free to leave it in the comments below, and I will see you next time.